these rukhas. Rukhas is a relaxation of a normal, strict rule. And the Prophet ﷺ, in one hadith, he mentioned that Allah loves that people, they avail themselves of the dispensations, the rukhas that Allah has provided them, but also we're not supposed to transgress. So, what are these parameters that we have to observe in applying this maxim? First of all, as we mentioned in another episode, the necessity must be present and not just anticipated. So an example from classical times was people are on a ship, they're sailing in the ocean, and they see really dark clouds on the horizon and they're coming towards the ship. So they know that a really big storm is going to hit them. So the people who run the ship, they can't just start taking passengers' belongings and throwing them overboard, because if the storm hits them and it becomes necessary at that point to get rid of some of the weight on the boat in order for everybody to survive, then it becomes lawful for them to do that, but not when it's just a maybe. Now, one of the examples that we discussed, we're doing a book on this in the institute where I work, we discussed an example that one of our researchers had suggested. We discussed it at considerable length because the issue was very much, controversial. To what extent is the danger present? The whole issue of overpopulation and the great numbers of people using resources, degrading those resources to a point where the planet will no longer be able to sustain the number of human beings at the current level. Now, there are signs of degradation of the environment all over the place. The glaciers are melting everywhere, the ice caps are melting. Most climate scientists agree that this is due to human impact upon the environment, the burning of fossil fuels in particular. The fish stocks in the ocean are being decimated by overfishing. There are various signs of environmental distress all over the place. But does this allow a government to step in and say, you know what, you can't have any more children, to people who have 3 or 4? And this is a situation that people in India, I'm sure, are familiar with, where the government at one point was sterilizing people without their knowledge, without their consent. And of course, that created a massive backlash, because these are fundamental human rights, the right to reproduce, the right to choose those issues. So at this point in time, is this an impending necessity, a darura, which is still in the future, or is it something which is upon us? Does the situation warrant government stepping in to interfere with people's private choices about how many children they will have? And when phrased in that way, I agreed with my colleagues that governments are not justified in stepping in on that level. The second parameter for how this principle works is that the period of the relaxation lasts only as long as that pressing need is existent. So if you have a need that comes into existence and that triggers the relaxation of a normal rule, that need continues for a period, and then the situation changes and the need disappears. As soon as it disappears, then the permission also disappears with it, and the rule returns back to its original status. The normal status is that the act is prohibited. And because of that being an important principle, jurists have actually mentioned a separate maxim for it. It says, مَا أُبِيحَ لِلضَّرُورَةِ بَطَلَ بِزَوَالِهَا. Anything permitted due to the existence of darura will cease once it has passed. Okay, and then another parameter is that there should be no lawful alternative to the prohibited means that a person is using in order to deal with this crisis situation. So if you have a lawful means to still satisfy your need, you can't say, I'm forced to use these unlawful means, which is pretty straightforward and clear. If there are a number of prohibited options, and there are no lawful options in dealing with a situation, and there's a number of prohibited options, and the seriousness of the prohibition differs between option A and option B, then the less serious prohibition is the one that should be chosen in that circumstance. Also, you sometimes need expert consideration in order to determine whether a situation has reached the level where the prohibited becomes permissible. Now, a classic example of that is morphine. There are certain operations and certain kinds of illnesses where, obviously for an operation, you would normally need anesthetic. There are certain illnesses which are critical, and you're going to die from it, like certain kinds of cancer. They're incredibly painful. In those situations, a doctor would be needed to say, okay, this person is at a level of suffering where they need morphine, and this is the amount that they need. Sometimes when a situation is one of public necessity, then in those contexts, in that kind of a situation, then the entity which would decide whether this is a situation that requires resorting to prohibited means, that would be the government. It's not up to private individuals in those situations to make those judgment calls. And there are certain prohibited acts which you just can't do under any circumstances due to necessity. For instance, you want to kill somebody to save your life. If the person attacks you, that's something else. The Prophet ﷺ, he was asked about somebody who wants to take the person's money. He said, defend yourself. Don't give him the money. He said, he's going to fight me. He said, well, defend yourself. He says, what happens if he kills me? He said, you'll go to paradise. What happens if I kill him? He'll go to the fire. So in that situation, that's not what we're talking about here. Let's say that a person, this kind of thing happened in some of these concentration camps, like in the Bosnian War. A person is given a choice: kill that person or I will kill you. In that situation, he's not allowed to kill that person. He has to be patient and accept that he's going to die. Okay, we'll take a break and we'll come back, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Riaz Ansary from the United States, and you're watching Peace TV.
Dialogue. Discussion. Debate. Rebuttal. Conclusion.
Eliminate misconceptions about religion. Get enlightened.
Witness Dr. Zakir Naik in a battle of words in Crossfire, next on Peace TV. Peace TV, the solution for humanity.
My name is Shakiri.
My name is Naseem Abdul Rahman.
My name is Faraz Wahaj.
My name is Musa Bennett.
I was a Christian.
Hindu.
I had a Christian upbringing.
When I asked 10 people about Hinduism, I used to get 10 different answers.
My heart was attracted to Islam.
I used to ask a lot of questions to the priests, and I wasn't getting the answers.
Why did I become a Muslim? Allah knows best.
Alhamdulillah, I've made the right choice.
My Choice. Every Saturday at 6:30 p.m. UK and 7:30 p.m. Europe on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. Okay, we're talking about the parameters of applying this principle that pressing need becomes a reason for the relaxation or the permissibility of normally prohibited acts. And there are certain prohibited acts which you just can't do under any circumstances due to necessity. For instance, you want to kill somebody to save your life. If the person attacks you, that's something else. The Prophet ﷺ, he was asked about somebody who wants to take the person's money. He said, defend yourself. Don't give him the money. He said, he's going to fight me. He said, well, defend yourself. He says, what happens if he kills me? He said, you'll go to paradise. What happens if I kill him? He'll go to the fire. So in that situation, that's not what we're talking about here. Let's say that a person, this kind of thing happened in some of these concentration camps, like in the Bosnian War. A person is given a choice: kill that person or I will kill you. In that situation, he's not allowed to kill that person. He has to be patient and accept that he's going to die. And now we look at the implications of darura with regard to the rule. When you have these very pressing needs, what it means for the person in that situation is that that act, which is normally unlawful, for that person it becomes lawful during that time. So he would not face any questioning from Allah in the hereafter. Why did you do that? Because his circumstances for him made the act lawful. The other implication of darura, however, is that because the exception was made due to exceptional circumstances, it doesn't affect the standard normal rule regarding that act, which is that it's prohibited under normal circumstances. And I think we talked about in an earlier episode about the kind of evidence that this principle is based upon. There's one that we didn't mention, which is a really interesting case from the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he was the Khalifa. A woman was brought and she confessed to having committed adultery. And then when they got the details of her case, it became one in which there was extenuating circumstances. She was with her family's camels, and she was out in the desert, and she was tending the flock. And she got to a place where there was no water, and it happened that the camels, which she had, they weren't producing milk at that time, and she ran out of water. And so she came upon somebody who also was out there with camels, and he had water. And she asked him for water, and he refused unless she allowed him to have his way with her. And so she had reached a point where she was dying of thirst, and this man he had no mercy. So she gave in order to save her life. Now, when this case was brought before Umar, and he was listening to it, and Ali ibn Abi Talib was sitting there with him, and Ali, he analyzed the case, on the basis of darura, and he suggested that the penalty should not be applied in the case of this woman, and Omar agreed with him. That's in the Musannaf of Abdul Razak, by the way. Now, some of the examples of this and how it plays out in fiqh cases, it's a well-known situation or a rule from Surah An-Nahl that if a Muslim is forced, threat of death, to say words that would be normally considered statements of disbelief, he's allowed to make those statements in that situation as long as his heart abhors what he is being forced to say. Another example of its application is with regard to blood. Blood is najis. It's one of the impure substances. And so it's prohibited to eat or drink blood or to eat, things that are made out of blood. So based on that, the prohibition of eating it is that it shouldn't enter your body. And so if you directly put blood into your bloodstream, it should also be prohibited. However, there are situations where people need blood transfusions. You're having an operation. If you don't get a transfusion, you'll die. So the rules of ritual purity, they are subsidiary to the Sharia's objective of protecting life. So in that situation, it's virtually a matter of consensus that blood transfusions are lawful. Another example is with regard to autopsies. As I repeated numerous times in the course of this series, one of the objectives of the Sharia is to preserve human dignity. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Allah says, we have honored the children of Adam. And one of the items of evidence for this principle is that it's prohibited to do anything to demean a dead person. Even while you're alive, you're supposed to be treated with respect and honored also after you die. So it's prohibited to break a person's bone after they're dead, just as it's prohibited to do so when they're alive. And so based upon that, autopsies are prohibited. The normal rule would be that you can't cut somebody open after they die, because it's a way of showing disrespect for that human body. However, let's say that there is an infectious disease that has broken out in a locality, and people die that exhibit some of the symptoms of that disease. Now, the authorities in that situation, they need to be able to determine whether those people actually died from that disease in order to know how fast the disease is spreading, and in order to know what kind of procedures need to be put in place in order to try to prevent that disease from spreading further and killing other people. So in that situation, performing an autopsy on those persons would be permissible based on this principle. Now, this is a kind of a sidebar, but there are other justifications for performing autopsies in certain other cases, but it's not based upon this principle. It's based on other principles. Like, for instance, medical students, they need to know how the human body is put together in order to be able to develop the level of skill in delivering medical services that is expected in our era. So for them to perform autopsies in order to learn their profession, to become skillful at their profession, there are plenty of scholars who allow that with certain qualifications about how it's done, but the basis for allowing that is not because of darurat. It's maslaha, general benefit, and things like that. With regard to the application of the principle in Islamic finance or in financial issues, the normal rule for are putting your money into a conventional bank is that it's not allowed. If you're a Muslim, you're not allowed to do it. Even if your account is not an interest-bearing account, because you are giving your money to them and allowing them to use it for interest-bearing purposes, so you are facilitating an evil. However, let's say you live in a non-Muslim country, there are no Islamic banks, and the place where you live, there are a lot of robberies, and there's no place safe to keep your money except a bank. In that situation, that would become a cause for relaxation of that normal rule to put it into a non-interest-bearing account in order to protect your wealth, because preserving wealth is one of the major objectives of the Sharia. Another example that normally people are supposed to be able to use their property according to their choices. But let's say that there's a financial crisis in a country, and suddenly people want to transfer their funds out of the country to another location. Now, if everybody with money does that, the economy of the country will drastically suffer, and people will lose jobs. All kinds of really bad things will happen regarding people's ability to survive and livelihood. So in that situation, the government has the right and perhaps the obligation to step in and say, wait a minute, you can't transfer your funds right now. You have to keep them here, because otherwise there will be too much harm to the society as a whole. Another example that I used to hear a lot when I was a fairly new Muslim, with regard to insurance for your car. If you don't get insurance, in many countries you can't drive a car. And if you're living in places where the transportation system is pretty poor, public transportation is not very good, then it's very difficult for you to get to your job on time without a car. So in those situations, for you to take conventional insurance when there's no alternative to it for your car, that would be lawful, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
إلهي أنت ربي ذو الجلال علمت بما نويت بلا جدال إلهي قد أتيت